Hello, everybody, and welcome to this very special event co-hosted by Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development at the University of Oxford and the High Commission of India to the United Kingdom. We're delighted to have a really special array of speakers on this topic, which is in the lead up to COP26. As we know, this is a big event at the end of this year where we're going to consider where we are on climate change and how we move forward in partnership across countries. So we have with us this wonderful range of speakers, and because we're sort of beyond time already, I'm going to go right into welcoming each of them, asking Her Excellency to give us a few remarks and then entering the discussion. While we do that, we also really extend a warm welcome to each of you. And it would be wonderful if you could write in the chat, tell us where you're from, where, what your interests are. And I really encourage you to ask questions because of the diversity of who we have with us for this hour. So I will begin by first thanking Her Excellency for being there with us, for co-hosting this event. Introduce her very briefly because she really needs no introduction. She is the High Commissioner UK. Before this, she's been the High Commissioner to the European Union, Belgium, and Luxembourg. She's held a variety of posts in the Ministry of External Affairs for the Government of India, and we're really looking forward to hearing from her in a couple of minutes. Before I do that, I also want to introduce the rest of our speakers, the first of whom is the Right Honourable Patricia Hewitt. She's the advisor to the UK Board of Trade and has had a long and distinguished career in government, business, and the non-for-profit sector. She was Health Secretary to the United Kingdom between 2005 and 2007, Member of Parliament for Leicester West. And in 2009, she was appointed the chair of the UK-India Business Council, and she held that post for over a decade. Thank you so much for being with us, Patricia. Our next speaker is Mr. Godrej, Chairman of the Board of Godrej Boyce and Manufacturing Company Limited. He holds a number of different chairs, including co-chair of the India-UK and the India-US Track 2 Dialogue on Energy and Climate Change. And he's the founding trustee of the Adanta Aspen Center, chairman of the board of directors of the Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, India Resources Trust, Council of Energy, Environment and Water, and director of the World Resources Institute in the United States. Thank you, Mr. Godrej, for being here. And then finally, we have our own Professor Miles Allen. He's Professor of Geosystem Science in the School of Geography and Environment at the University of Oxford. He's head of the Climate Dynamics Group in the university's Department of Physics, and his research focuses on how human and natural influences on climate contribute to observed climate change and the risks of extreme weather. He served as the IPCC's lead author for many of its assessment reports dating back to 2001, and most recently for the lead author on the detection and attribution of climate change from global to regional for the 5th assessment report in 2013. Thank you, Miles. So with that, if I may request Her Excellency to give us a few remarks to inaugurate this series that the Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development and the Indian High Commission are co-hosting in the lead up to COP. This is our first dialogue within that series. We'd be very grateful.
Thank you, with pleasure, Professor Radhika Khosla. I would warmly greet Mr. Jamshed Godrej, Right Honourable Madam Patricia Hewitt, Professor Miles Allen, and all the other distinguished participants. I'm absolutely delighted that we are. Of course, it would have been wonderful if we could host this in person at the High Commission or at a joint venue and have everybody here physically. But I'm delighted that we are co-hosting this inaugural webinar. We intend this to be the first in a series of dialogues highlighting India's contribution to the global community's effort in slowing or reversing climate change and mitigating its impact on humanity and the world that we live in. This is also very important for a number of reasons. Firstly, because we celebrate once again the long association of Oxford University with India over 4 centuries. And many prominent Indians have studied or held key positions at the Oxford University. And over a number of years, bilateral programs have strengthened our academic linkages and networks of friendship and collaborations. And Somerville College has historic links with India dating back to 1889. I thought it would be interesting for Mr. Jamshed Godrej to know that it was Cornelia Sorabji who became the first Indian woman to study at Oxford, and actually the first woman of any nationality to read law at Oxford. So this center, the Oxford India Center for Sustainable Development, created in 2013, we think that this, it has this development agenda, which is to advance India's sustainable development agenda, supporting postgraduate study, pioneering multidisciplinary research, and knowledge exchange and dissemination. And the focus has been on climate change, sustainable cooling, urbanization, food and nutrition, health and technology. As part of the agenda of the Oxford India Center for Sustainable Development, it was felt that it was important in the lead up to COP26 to share through this platform the vision and contribution and further objectives of India. So we plan to involve a cross-section of our people in UK and in India in discussing options, our successes, and the pathways going forward. And all those themes that I've just mentioned actually very rightly anticipated back in 2013 the urgent priorities of today, which have overnight become the central focus of the global community in a pandemic hit world. So it's heartening and quite natural that Government of India's efforts are robustly supported by India's enlightened corporate leadership. And I offer the eminent partners and participants in today's discussions my warm thanks, and so happy that they are with us in this discussion and in our efforts for India and for a better world in the context of sustainable development. I'm glad that we have with us a very notable and eminent representative of India's corporate effort on climate in the person of Mr. Jamshed Godrej himself. As Professor Khosla mentioned, he's co-chair of the India-US and India-UK Track 2 Dialogue on Energy and Climate Change. He's also chairman of a premier sustainable energy foundation in India, the Shakti Foundation, and a trustee for a worldwide fund for nature among his other valuable efforts for climate change. So while I'd leave it to Mr. Godrej to speak on behalf of the private sector, I would say that not only in India, but all over the world, it is a private sector that can and must engage every day and in every way with the impact of, with mitigating the impact of its productivity on climate change. In India, sustainability has been a tradition, and our daily rituals remind us of the supremacy of nature and the importance of preserving it and our responsibility to protect it. Yet, with industrialization and the pressure of populations, we have managed in our industrial hubs and urban centers to actually threaten this balance. And inspired by the father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi, who believed that Mother Nature has enough to fulfill man's needs, but not greed. India has, over the years, made sustainable development, renewals, and efficient use of resources the center of our development strategies. So from clean energy and energy efficiency to afforestation and preservation and restoration of biodiversity, we have come a long way with notable achievement in each of these key areas. Excuse me. India has not only, in fact, I'm happy to say, met our commitments under the Paris Agreement, but we have in fact exceeded them. At the January 2021 Climate Adaptation Summit, our Honorable Prime Minister had declared that India would not just arrest environmental degradation, but reverse it. And not just create new capacities, but make them an agent for global good. So the nationally determined contributions submitted by India, these include the target to reduce emissions intensity of our GDP by about 33 to 35% by 2030, and to achieve about 40% non-fossil fuel-based installed capacity for our power by 2030. So needless to say, the private sector is a part of India's massive effort. And just to save time, I'd very quickly mention a few of the elements. For example, our financial markets are making efforts to encourage sustainability through green bonds, raising finance for renewable energy projects primarily. And now that is a $6 billion market in India. Also, our banking sector is providing low interest, easy loans for completion of renewable energy projects. And our top CEOs have actually issued a declaration that they will help India achieve the COP21 targets with a transformative shift to a low carbon economy. And many of India's real breakthrough innovations are actually frugal innovations. So they are affordable, adaptable, immediately usable. And our companies are really going out of their way to look for such innovations and innovative practices to harness energy efficiently, dispose waste effectively, use our natural resources optimally. And, for example, we have a retrofit emission control device for diesel generators, which do not reduce energy efficiency, but decrease 90% of particulate emissions. And this is a Delhi-based foundation called the Chakra Innovations. You can look it up. Then there's a Hyderabad-based Recycle, KAL, which uses cloud-based web and mobile applications to track waste and promote recycling. Another two quick examples: India's first 75-seater solar ferry built by Naval solar and electric boats that can cruise for over 6 hours on solar power. And then there's a Cellzyme biotech from Coimbatore, which uses engineered enzyme to make antibiotics at room temperature. So that's a process that reduces carbon footprints. And then you have Agni Sumukh, an innovative, energy efficient, radiant heat gas burners, which save 30% energy. And then, of course, microwaves are now being made in India to treat infectious waste and eliminate air emissions, including POPs. And of course, the most popular is Godrej company's Chotu Cool fridge, which is based on a thermoelectric chip. So having mentioned these examples, I'm sure our participants and the distinguished speakers will elaborate more on how the private sector is really taking forward the government agenda, which is substantial, and the initiatives are huge and substantial. But I would just to give way to the other speakers, I'd like to conclude by quickly recalling a sentence from The Pale Blue Dot by Carl Sagan, who said that, I quote, "The earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. So like it or not, for the moment, the earth is where we make our stand," unquote. So I think that's an important reminder. And I thank you for this. And I'm going to be listening very carefully to everybody else. And hearty congratulations to the center and to Professor Khosla's team for launching this series of dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. It's really a privilege to have you with us. And what a wonderful way to set the stage for the conversation we're about to have on the role of the private sector and the ways in which that role can be expanded, in the ways in which that role can be moved forward from just a few companies to include a much wider set of smaller and medium-sized companies to actually engage seriously in this topic. I'll once again just say to the audience, please keep writing in the chat. Let's make this as interactive as we can. We're also live streaming on YouTube, and we'll try and get the chat messages from there as well. But let's go into our discussion now and start by looking at the arc, both in the UK and in India, on private sector engagement with climate change. So Patricia, if I can start with you, you've been the chair of the UK-India Business Council for over a decade, and now you're the advisor to the UK Board of Trade. How and when did you think and see environmental sustainability and climate change become a mainstream conversation within the UK's private sector?
Thank you so much, Radhika. It's such an interesting question there. But I must also just say what a great pleasure it is to be here. I'm also the chair of the advisory board for the Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development. And it's just such a privilege to have just heard the High Commissioner's very inspiring address and to be here with such distinguished panelists and so many wonderful participants. So thank you. Now, on your question, let me just draw on my personal experience. About 11 years ago now, I joined the board of Eurotunnel, GetLink. This is the company that runs the Channel Tunnel linking the UK to France. And we run the shuttle trains, the freight trains and passenger trains that run through that tunnel, as well as running the infrastructure. And I remember being very struck when the chairman and chief executive of Eurotunnel talked about the importance of sustainability and the environment. Now, this was 11 years ago, and you didn't often hear that from major corporates. And I have to admit, I was a bit skeptical. I thought, is this really important to our business? Or is it just, some kind of nice window dressing? And I very rapidly learned as a non-executive director that even then, it was really important to our business, because as well as being important in its own right, it was an important source of competitive advantage, because the tunnel is not just the fastest, but the cleanest, greenest way to cross between the United Kingdom and the continent. So what's been fascinating is just, I would say, in the last 3 years or so, our investors, who really weren't raising this as an issue 11 years ago, now raise it as an issue constantly. And this is not just specialist green fund investors. This is pension funds investing, across pretty much every sector in the world. So you're seeing increasingly this pressure from investors and from the corporate governance advisors saying, what are you doing on sustainability? What are the science-based targets you're setting? Where is your report? Is this being discussed at the AGM? Do you have a non-executive director who's leading for the board on climate change and sustainability? I now have the privilege of that role on the GetLink board, as it's now called. So that's a completely different investment climate, and that impacts not just on the major listed companies, but also on smaller companies that are looking potentially to raise funds, whether that's through private equity or on one of the markets. So huge change there, and driven, I would say, not so much by government policy as by the fact that, perhaps led by insurance companies and people who are specialists in risk, the private sector can see for themselves the absolute urgency of tackling climate change and the financial consequences, to put it bluntly, of not doing so.
Thank you, Patricia. That is really interesting. And it's wonderful that you're in that role to really witness the change as it happens. Miles, if I may turn to you, as someone who's been instrumental in the science behind the climate budget, how would you say that the UK's private sector has fared with respect to climate action?
Well, the UK's got a positive story to tell. I mean, emissions have come down more since 1990 than almost any other major developed economy, for all sorts of reasons. And one thing which I do like to stress, because people like to pull out these scorecards of countries' progress on emissions, at the end of the day, countries don't emit. Companies emit. Individuals emit. Countries create the conditions in which companies and individuals make the decisions they make that result in emissions. But, with a few notable exceptions we needn't go into, by and large, the state isn't the major source of emissions. So it is the way companies make these decisions and the framework that they work in that will determine whether we actually achieve our climate goals. And I actually sometimes feel it's a little frustrating in the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, how much everything seems to come back to, how much did your country emit last year? And this kind of scorecarding, which I'm not sure is terribly helpful. What really matters is the decisions made by companies like Godrej and Boyce, some of whose emissions no doubt originate in India, others will originate in other parts of the world. And it's the company's decisions going forward that really will determine our climate, our climate progress. And I think that's one thing which has really happened over the past 10 years is that the private sector has recognized this. But what I'm less confident about is, and this might be sort of passing the ball back to Patricia, is whether the public sector or politicians have recognized the absolutely vital role that they will need to play to provide the private sector with a supportive regulatory environment to allow private companies to do the right thing. Because at the moment, we've got quite a tension emerging between companies that want to do the right thing, but are realizing that if they go too far down the green route, they potentially put themselves at a competitive disadvantage with their peers who may be sort of less interested or perhaps cynically just see a main chance in not being too green. And so companies are going to need politicians' support in actually going in this direction. So it's that sort of lockstep between government regulation and private industry innovation that I think we haven't quite got to yet. So everybody's making the right noises, but we're all still in a position of sort of waiting for others to move first. That's where I feel we are at the moment.
Thank you, Miles. That's really useful to lay out that tension. I'd like to compare that with what's happening in India. And Mr. Godrej, if you may, it would be wonderful to get a sense of the trajectory of India's private sector engagement with climate change and what you identify as the biggest shift to date in how companies have engaged with the climate issue.
Thank you, Radhika, and greetings to my panelists and to the audience and to the High Commissioner in the UK. And I really do appreciate that the Oxford India Centre for Sustainable Development at the University of Oxford and the High Commission have got together on this series. It would be very helpful. So coming to the private sector in India, I think you know that, Radhika, that the private sector has been engaging on issues of climate change actually for many decades. More than 20 years ago, the Confederation of Indian Industry started this process through our energy efficiency work with industry. And it has been such a wonderful journey to see how the companies in India have engaged on energy efficiency over the years. And you may be aware that, for instance, the cement industry in India is amongst the most energy efficient in the world. And this has come through because industry associations have worked very closely with industry and with experts in the field to find solutions, because the biggest driver in India has been the very high cost of energy. And I think you may be aware of the fact that there are very few consumers in India who actually pay for energy. And so those who do pay a very high price for energy. And so the business case for businesses to work on energy efficiency and renewable energy is actually very strong. And I think the other area that CII has worked in for many, many decades now actually is on green buildings. And today, India has the second largest stock of rated green buildings in the world. So I think that it's not something new. That I just want to place that on record that, this is something that we have been working on for a long time. But that given, obviously India has a long, long way to go. It's a large country, large number of companies, industries, a very large sector of small, medium, and tiny sector, which in many ways, they are the ones who actually, have a large footprint on energy throughout the country, but are very difficult in the sense to manage in terms of energy efficiency and modern practices. So there are many, many challenges. But I would say that for renewable energy, this is one of the really good stories in India. I think, from less than 20 megawatts in 2010 to over 95,000 megawatts of solar, wind, biomass, and small hydro, is a huge jump. And all of this has been driven, almost all of this has been driven by the private sector. And I think that we recognize that the mainstay for power in India is thermal energy. Unless we see that huge uptick in renewable energy taking place, the dependence on coal and thermal energy is going to take some time. So I think we have to work on this transition. It has to be a just transition. I think there's a lot being spoken about on how this transition should not leave behind those who are less able to take advantage of it. But it is a very important transition. The other area, that has suddenly taken off in India is electric mobility. And you're seeing a huge interest in, especially in two-wheelers and increasingly in three-wheelers for movement of small cargoes, etc. And I think the major automobile companies in India also will move in that direction pretty fast. But it's really heartening to see how quickly the uptake on small EVs like two-wheelers has taken off. And, the other area that is really important for private sector is that this is a huge business opportunity. And we are actually seeing, large numbers of private sector entrepreneurs who are taking an interest in renewable energy investment. And many of them have raised significant sums of money globally to be able to do that. And the ambition that comes from many of the leading companies in India to, move towards a sort of a net zero type of situation for their own companies, is that ambition is just amazing. And there are many global platforms such as EP100 and others, which are supporting this move of the private sector to move towards a greater dependence on renewable energy, less on fossil, but also, looking at how transformation is going to take place in every industry segment. The fact that, industries like cement and steel are very difficult to actually turn around. But work has started in that area. So I think, we see this as a huge opportunity. As you know, in India, jobs are probably like everywhere else, including the UK, jobs are really, really important. And the renewable energy sector and this transformation can also create huge opportunity for jobs. I mean, for instance, CEEW has estimated that in India alone, we can have a 53 billion market for startups and renewables and entrepreneurs to come in and And so livelihoods can also be promoted through this. So broadly speaking, I would say, Radhika, that yes, India has been doing a lot. But of course, we all know that whatever we do is not going to be enough, because a lot more needs to be done if we are going to stay within that target of 1.5 degrees centigrade increase in global temperature before the end of the century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Godrej. That's really wonderful to get that history, both for the UK and for India. As we look ahead and towards the target, towards the piling up of climate impacts, and also towards broadening the scope, like you said yourself, a lot of small and medium scale companies and industries are not necessarily part of the conversation, and climate change may not be a priority, quite rightly so. I'd like to talk about tipping points, right? Like with the experience that the three of you have, where do you see the tipping point where we move from our current trajectory to one that is dramatically different? And it could also, you're also welcome to talk about a tipping point you may have already witnessed. Renewables could potentially be one in the Indian case. But when it would be very useful for our audience and for us to understand, when have we seen that step change, or when can we foresee that step change, where the system as a whole is responding differently? And when I say system here, I mean the private sector, the companies, not just the big ones, but also the small and medium scale ones. Mr. Godrej, maybe I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. Well, I must say that if you look at almost all the large companies in India, which account for, say, 80% of stock market capitalization in India, they are all working in this area at different levels. They're companies who are at different levels of achievement. I think for India to achieve this type of a tipping point, we really have to be able to find ways to take along the entire private sector in India, which actually, when you look at both employment, investment, number of units, is really the small and medium sector. And the only way that we can work with them is in partnership with the large companies. The supply chain, as you know, is very, very important. And most of the emissions, as the professor will tell us, is actually in the supply chain. It's not so much in the primary units. It's the transport. It's all the linkages, etc. That account for it. Now, this is a very hard to do subject. How to take along a very large number of smaller units. I think what has worked the best so far for India is that you actually create an ecosystem of suppliers to each company. So that, if you start aggregating, that every large company would have, say, hundreds of suppliers. How do you create that ecosystem with the main company and its suppliers to work together and jointly in achieving these goals? I think when you move in that direction, we make a lot of difference. For instance, we worked in our appliance business with all our suppliers. We started many years ago, and we said we want 80% of our buy value to be sustainable. So we said, let's work with each and every one of them. And we did that. And each one of them, we've been able to achieve what is known as, there's a green company rating system that CII has been promoting. And each one of them have come very close to being platinum at the highest level. So I think if we do that, which means that every company, every large, medium-sized company works with all its suppliers, I think in time, I can't tell you how long it would take, but then you would reach a tipping point. But I don't think we have reached that tipping point yet, but there is a lot of work to be done in that respect.
Thank you. That's incredibly useful. Miles, I'm going to turn it over to you because thinking about upstream suppliers and working through the upstream is something that you've been quite vocal about.
Yes, well, for me, the tipping point that we still seem to be a long way away from is recognizing that the fossil fuel industry, the industry selling the product that's primarily causing the problem, has a duty to be part of the solution, not just seen as the problem. It was really striking for me. A couple of years ago, I was speaking to one of the world's major oil and gas companies about the 1.5 degrees report, which had just been released. I got the inevitable question, do you actually think there's any chance of us meeting 1.5 degrees? And I asked them, well, if you had to decarbonize your product, if you had to dispose of 1 ton of carbon dioxide for every ton generated by your activities and products, including your scope 3 emissions, by 2050, would you be able to do so? And they just said, well, somebody said immediately, well, would the same rules apply to everybody? So I said, okay, yeah, if the same rules apply to everybody, would you be able to do it? And they just said, of course we would. This industry could stop climate change within a generation, but they have to have the regulatory environment to require them to do that. And that's what we're not talking about at COP. It's what we're not talking about in these negotiations, because the solution is there, but it has to have a regulatory environment to make it happen. The way they would do it, to some extent, I would say be up to them, but basically we know what they would do. They would be pumping carbon dioxide back underground at the same rate that they're pumping oil and gas up. For the likes of the coal industry, the same solution in principle could apply. The coal industry, the cement industry in particular, could capture carbon dioxide that it generates and pump it back underground. But of course, it affects prices. It's a more expensive, it's infinitely cheaper to dump carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than it is to dispose of it safely back underground or turn it back into rock. So that's why we need regulation to make this happen. But the big tipping point would be for everybody to realize that it could happen. If the industry were told to do it, they would just do it.
Thanks, Miles. If only it was so straightforward to tell the industry to do it. There's the whole political economy behind that. Mr. Godrej laughs, so maybe we'll come back to it. But Patricia, can I ask you the same question about what you see as a tipping point?
My own sense is that there are going to be a whole series of tipping points. It won't just be one thing where we can say, here today is the tipping point across the whole of the economy and indeed the whole of the world. So if I look back, there has already been, both in the UK and in India, a quite extraordinary shift in power supply towards renewables. And India, of course, extraordinary, going from zero really on solar electricity to being, I think, the largest solar generator in the world. And in the UK, really through a series of policy instruments that reinforced and pulled through more private investment, we've seen a very significant shift towards renewables, accompanied, I think very significantly, by a growing attack on renewables from people who would prefer to think that climate change didn't exist or didn't matter, as part of a sort of broader culture wars. I think we're seeing a similar shift in the UK now towards electric vehicles. And it absolutely reinforces Miles's point about the need for government action, regulation, or in some cases, pricing and taxation policy that creates a level playing field, but also says, this is where we are going. I mean, years ago when I was in government, we effectively created a very big switch in motor vehicles towards diesel. Very good for climate change, turned out to be absolutely disastrous for asthma, bronchitis, and respiratory health. And quite rightly, the government has switched away from that and is now saying it's going to be a shift to electric vehicles. They've set the date, they've created, and I think this is also critical, more public-private partnerships to re-engineer, in effect, the whole infrastructure of, petrol pumps that you have to have if you're going to have that switch to electric. And I think that combination of government action and regulation to create the level playing field, the kind of partnerships between the public and the private sector that government can play a part on, for instance, through the catapult centers here that bring industry, academia and the science base and government together. We've got 1 or 2 catapults, I think, represented amongst our participants. The supply chain partnerships that Mr. Godrej was talking about, which are critical. And then the other part of this, equally important, is the bottom-up work where you have consumers, you have civic society, civil society and the NGOs, you have communities, potentially, and I think actually in India through the panchayats, for instance, saying, how do we green our local community? How can we live more sustainably? And that these things are all mutually reinforcing, but each is weaker without the other. And I suspect some of them can't really function at all unless government is playing its part.
Thank you, Patricia. That really brings, the whole conversation we've had together on tipping points. I'd like to pick up on that government point and ask Mr. Godrej, do we, where do you see the signal coming from, right? Miles and Patricia are talking about the need for the signal coming from government. Are there instances where the signal could actually come from the private sector to the government? And do you see that as a pathway?
Yes, I think that, one of the reasons why, as I mentioned earlier, the private sector was very keen on energy efficiency. I think part of that reason was because industry was, subjected to huge tariffs on electricity and making us uncompetitive. Not only, if just from an international perspective, when we look at trade, there are so many factors involved in trade, but energy, especially energy intensive industries, this is a really crucial subject. So the private sector has been actually wanting a complete overhaul of the energy system in India. And by that, what I mean is that today, for instance, the agricultural sector, does not essentially pay for energy. I mean, they get free energy, they get free water. Now you can certainly argue that this is essential for India's farmers, especially since many of them are marginal farmers, and many have very, very small holdings. But the effect of that is that it becomes a political subject, and when it becomes a political subject, it's very difficult to make that complete about turn to say that, we should have a rational energy system in the country. So I think that the pressure is there from the private sector to the government. And it's when we say government, in India, of course, and I'm sure everywhere else in the world, it's not only the central government, it's the local and the state governments, etc. Their actions actually count for a lot more than what policy there may be at the central level. And we need to turn this around. As you probably know, most of the electricity generating and distributing companies, which are state level entities, most of them are in terrible financial condition. And unless that type of restructuring is done, so the pressure from the private sector is essentially that we need an efficient, and a working energy system in India that will be able to deliver what industry and the country needs. Everybody needs an efficient power system. And this, I think, is coming from the private sector as a pressure. So yes, but, government signals are important. I think we cannot ignore that. When our prime minister made a very, very ambitious target for renewable energy, I think, eyes popped out at that time to say that, is this really doable today we see that, yes, it is doable. And more of that is possible. So government signals are critical and important, but I think that interaction between the private sector and government to have a good, rational policy that meets climate goals is really critical.
Thank you. That's very helpful. You touched on trade, and Patricia, I'd like to go back to you in your role as the advisor to the UK Board of Trade and ask, the big question, which is at what point will countries say that you don't trade with countries that don't have a robust climate change policy?
This is a really interesting issue, Radhika. Thank you for raising it. And I'm absolutely not a sort of technical expert on this, but clearly there is growing and rather urgent interest in the idea of carbon border adjustments, so that from a global or a trade perspective, you create a system of free and fair trade. You create a level playing field between national producers working within the national, or indeed for the EU producers, EU framework of carbon and climate change regulation, and manufacturers or producers in other countries who may be working in a very different framework and in a sense arguably dumping their emissions on us by underpricing their products. I mean, that is roughly speaking the argument. Miles would be much more technically adept at this than I am. My worry about it is that there is always a temptation for the richer countries of the world to find excuses for protectionism against the poorer and middle income and developing countries of the world. I saw this, I have to say, and I was a Remainer in the Brexit debate, but as a trade minister within the European Union, I argued very strongly against some of the agricultural phytosanitary requirements that were just crippling farmers and exporters in African and Asian countries, not actually because those restrictions were justified in the interests, in this case, of protecting health and safety in the European Union, but essentially because they were a way of concealing protectionism and keeping goods out. So I just think one has to be very careful here about what are the real motives and what is the real justification for imposing those tariff or other restrictions on trade with countries at a different stage of development from those of us in the rich world. So that would be my, if you like, philosophical and policy caution about this. But clearly, it's going to be a growing issue. I think, as an advisor to the UK Board of Trade, as you'll have seen from Liz Truss, our Secretary of State for International Trade, from her pronouncements and many government reports, there is a real commitment in the UK government to promoting free and fair trade. There's a very welcome sense of momentum in the partnership between the UK and India, negotiations starting on a comprehensive economic partnership agreement, and listening to the High Commissioner's inspiring talk and her examples of Jagad, of sustainable innovation. It just reminded me how great the opportunities are for trade between our two countries and across the rest of the world in technologies and innovations that will actually help us both and help the world achieve that huge shift towards sustainability.
Thank you, Patricia. Miles, can I ask you to comment on this?
Yes, well, I agree wholeheartedly with what Patricia's saying about the danger. And in fact, I get very nervous about the prospect of climate being used as an excuse for protectionism. We're all too good at grabbing those excuses. And in many ways, it would be, for me, I would assume international companies like Mr. Godridge's will be quietly aghast about the prospect of bureaucrats moving in to measure the carbon content of individual products that you sell. That sounds like a recipe for nightmares. So I think it's far more important that we buy products from companies that have credible plans for their own transition to net zero and that are based in countries and producing in countries that also have credible plans for transition to net zero, then we start quibbling about what the exact carbon content of the individual product level is. And that's the direction in which I think the conversation needs to go. We will work with companies, we will work with countries that have plans to transition to net zero, and we will criticize those plans. It shouldn't just be a matter of, yeah, we've got a plan, that's it. The plan must be open to discussion, and so that, because there are plans and plans out there, and some of them are definitely better than others. So that's where we need to focus. I think if we start talking about, what is the carbon content of this product, we've lost the plot before we've even begun.
Mr. Godrej?
No, I can only second what Miles and Patricia have just said on this issue. I think, aside from being a highly complex technical issue, I think that, trade barriers of all types, whether for climate or other purposes, really should be reduced. I mean, we have to create that correct sort of way for countries to be able to trade in a fair way.
Thank you. I am conscious of time, and we have all these questions coming in, but we're also sort of nearing the end. What I might do is ask one question that has come in, and then we probably won't be able to get to all the audience questions. But one of the questions is that, do you think there is a role, and this is to all panelists, do you think there is a role for the private sector in India to further nature-based solutions like forest restoration? Why has nature-based solutions not been part of the dialogue, considering it's one of India's pillars in the NDC? And so this is sort of a broader question about nature-based solutions and whether the private sector can engage with that or not. Miles, maybe I'll turn it to you to answer that sort of, in a broader way, because that again is a topic we've had a lot of discussion about.
There's huge opportunities here, huge what we call co-benefits of investing in nature, both to store carbon and also to preserve biodiversity and the vital ecosystems of our planet. So clearly these are opportunities we need to take. From the perspective of climate, we also need to keep them in perspective, even at the most optimistic estimates of what we could do by through nature-based solutions in terms of storing climate in the biosphere. We might be talking about shaving, 1/10 of a degree off global temperatures by mid-century. That's just a few years of fossil fueled warming at the rate we're doing it at the moment. So yes, it's an important lever to pull. It's a very important investment to make for all sorts of reasons. But we also need to recognize that nature is not a get out of jail free card. We can't just say we're going to carry on burning fossil fuels and plant a few trees to compensate. I mean, so we need to, and there is also an important discussion that I hope is being had in the corridors of power about whose nature. This sounds a little philosophical, but when I hear that when I see that I can press a button when I buy a flight that I probably don't need in Europe to plant some trees in India to compensate for the carbon of that flight, I ask myself, really, what right have I got to those trees? Maybe it should be India's, they're India's trees, and maybe it's India's hard to abate sectors that should be retaining the right to those nature-based solutions in India. So I think that this is a big international conversation we need to be having about nature, because at the moment there's a bit of a danger of the wealthy, as it were, buying up nature to compensate for their emissions, and that's not what should happen, in my view. So these are big, deep conversations that need to be had.
Mm.
Great, thank you. So we're at time. If I can request just a couple of more minutes from everybody, including the High Commissioner, we'd be very grateful. My last question to everyone is going to be: if you had a magic wand and could move the private sector in one way, what would that be? Mr. Godrej, I'd start with you for the spot.
Well, I alluded to that a little bit earlier. I think that we really need a functioning and efficient energy system, which incorporates renewables and all types of other, whether they're nature-based or otherwise, solutions that can come together. So this is really important, that we have a good, efficient, functioning, and one which serves all customers, whether they are in agriculture or in industry or in trade. I mean, these are crucial things. For instance, we haven't even talked about cooling today, on this program. But as you well know, that's another huge area of concern for a developing country like India, which has very low penetration in cooling and is going to grow very rapidly in that area. And so there we need an integrated system. Let me put it that way. That should make things more efficient for everyone.
Thank you. And cooling is likely to be the topic of our second webinar in this series. So it's cool you brought it up. Patricia, may I turn to you with your magic wand?
I can't think of a magic wand exactly, but since by and large, the people in charge, particularly of larger businesses, tend to be of the older generations, as indeed I am, I think what I would say is just listen to what your children and your grandchildren are saying and think about their future in all the decisions that you're making in business. I'd say exactly the same thing to those who are in government.
Thank you. Miles?
Well, I couldn't really add to what Patricia's just said. As I said, although I did say earlier, the one thing that I always like to emphasize is that we need the industry itself that's producing fossil fuels to recognize that it has an obligation and an ability to get rid of the carbon dioxide they generate. We don't need to carry on using the atmosphere as a giant landfill for carbon dioxide. We can dispose of it properly, and we should be disposing of it properly. And everybody using fossil fuels today, not just those hard to abate sectors, has a duty to contribute to that transition.
Thank you, Miles. I'd like to turn to the High Commissioner again, if we may, for closing remarks, and just to say thank you to all of our panelists for being here, for staying a little bit over time, and for these really wonderful insights. High Commissioner.
Thank you so much, Professor Khosla. There's so much to say, but I would like to very strongly and very wholeheartedly associate myself with the remarks and the points so beautifully portrayed by the distinguished speakers before me. And I think each of the central themes that I've noted down should really become a theme for a webinar in the future. So I have taken notes, and I really very much appreciate whether it is the public participation, whether it is regulation, whether it is outsourcing of emissions, whether it is planting more trees. I have to say very quickly that we have the Green India mission, in which we have made huge strides in expanding forest cover. and in a vast country like India, it does make all the difference. And private sector coming in here, it would be a huge help. But this is just one of the millions of things that we can do. Must involve the community. So that also should be, as Madam Patricia Hewitt said, involve the youth. Listen to them. So let's make that also one of our sessions where we listen to ideas from the young people and how we can involve the community, because especially with plastic waste, these are the areas where we, it can be a huge concerted and collective effort, which is the need of the hour. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're so grateful. And thank you to all of our participants and for the audience for being wonderful. I'm going to end now as we're over time, but thank you very much from the Oxford India Center and the Indian High Commission.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.